The rave thing was really important. Punks, gangs of hooligans, skinheads, rockabillys. Raving wiped all that away. Raves were nuts to have that level of freedom. You used to stand in a field just feeling sorry for the people that weren't there to witness it or be part of that absolute revolution. Rave is more punk than punk ever was because kids didn't even think about breaking the law. They just wanted to get to a rave. The spirit was amazing. That's Gavin Watson, rave photographer. And I'm Stephen Coates, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. Gavin Watson there was talking about the first rave culture of the 1980s and early 1990s. I wasn't there, but I've heard about it. It was a kind of second summer of love, a reflowering perhaps of the countercultural wild spirits of the 1960s, fueled by a new kind of music, a new kind of technology, and a new kind of drug. It was followed in the late 90s and early noughties by another acid rave countercultural scene, of which I know nothing about whatsoever. The acid house squat parties taking place in abandoned buildings, in city centres, often right under the noses of the authorities and the property developers. Promoted, funded and operated by a radical bunch of daring, anarchistic, underground, resourceful characters, psychedelic pirates perhaps, motivated by a combination of good vibes, anti-establishmentarianism and music. Some of them veterans of that previous rave scene, some of them newcomers, inspired by those scenes. And such is my guest today, who's going to take us on a trip following his own journey deep into the heart of that scene. He's known as the tallest DJ in the world. He's a veteran of 1,000 festivals, promoter of festivals himself these days. And of course, he was a promoter of some of those acid house squat parties. He is Mr. William Wiles. Welcome, Will.
Hello, Stephen. Nice to be here.
Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture. Now, Will, you didn't quite start off as a DJ, as a festival guy, did you? You started off as a nice middle-class boy, didn't you?
I certainly did. I grew up in a series of vicarages in leafy suburbs in the 90s. When Castle Morton was going on and, you know, the sort of public moral panic about raving was at its peak, I was absorbing the stories through the Sunday Times principally.
Where did it all go wrong?
I've got two very strong memories of how I absorbed the Castle Morton events and things of that nature. One is I watched an episode of Inspector Morse with my family, which was all about the rave scene and was a kind of cautionary tale about it, how it was, you know, all going wrong for the participants, and it was all nice to start with, but it was all terrible, and it was run by gang bosses and things. And the other thing that I absorbed was I remember looking at a double-page spread in the Times in full colour with a big ecstasy tablet in the middle and lots of case studies from ravers or, you know, people who tried ecstasy. And of course they all had to kind of say that something bad had happened to them because they took it. And both items were sort of emphasising the fact that it's all fun to begin with, but then it all goes wrong. And so as a teenager, especially a teenager who went to church every week, you kind of absorb that and take it at face value. But the truth is you've got two things going on. One is going, oh, it'll end badly. You know, everyone's passionately smoking, anti-smoking when they're 12 and start smoking later, you know. And then the other part is you go, oh, part of you is appealed to it. It's kind of sexy and it's kind of interesting. And so as you get older and your attitude to risk changes, you kind of go, well, why not try it? It's supposed to be really fun.
Yeah, it's a funny change that, isn't it? But I mean, we should just backpedal a bit actually, because you mentioned Castle Morton, and that came up with a previous episode when we had Chris Tofu here talking about it. But for anybody who doesn't know what those two words Castle Morton signify, just tell us.
Well, I guess it was the zenith in public awareness of the 90s rave scene, because it was huge. It had a lot of coverage in the media and it went on all weekend. And so suddenly everyone knew about these massive raves that were happening that, somehow young people knew all about, but they didn't. And Disgusted at Tunbridge Wells kind of got on board, and the Criminal Justice Act came out of that.
Right, so it's the first time when it kind of that whole underground countercultural, free festival, free event sort of thing, illegal events as they became known, sort of popped into public consciousness on a big scale, was it?
Yes, and the things that I saw as a teenager were essentially, media articles and programs and things that had only really, that had been produced having found out about Castle Morton and then thought, well, we better say something about this then.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk really about your times, which is sort of 90s onwards in terms of that kind of rave culture and the free party scene or whatever, all that stuff. But in fact, that was the kind of, as you said to me earlier, it was the sort of second iteration of this stuff. It had really kind of started in 1988, right, with the acid house parties. Now, that's something I know nothing about. I mean, just give me a quick description about what that whole thing, the second summer of love, what did it all mean, and how did we get to, that Sunday Times article and that Inspector Morse episode?
The people that I was involved with putting on parties who were there talked about a time in their life where they went out every weekend to parties that were, I suppose to use the modern phrase, lit, and ecstasy was phenomenally strong. And more expensive, but you literally bought one tablet and you were good. The Summer of Love, from their stories of it, was an appropriate title. People were genuinely, it broke down boundaries, and there was music that you couldn't hear anywhere else, and people just went for it all weekend. I mean, I feel like some of the listeners will have had their own experiences with partying, and when it's really, really good, certain things happen that don't happen at other social occasions. And I think it was just the biggest amount you could imagine, and going on every weekend. And so people just didn't worry about other things that were going on in their life. They just lived to party for a bit.
I mean, this is what this says on the Museum of Youth Culture. It says, in the summer of 1988, a new kind of music appeared in clubs, abandoned warehouses and fields across the UK, and it became known as Acid House. With influences from Detroit, Chicago, Germany and Ibiza, rave was an international movement that Britain made its own. The second summer of love, as the summers of 88, 89 became known, redefined nightlife for generations to come. Well, so it's 20 years after the first summer of love, 67, 68, right? Isn't that amazing? Only 20 years, and in fact now it's 40 years ago. It's kind of strange sort of slipped into history. But I mean, Will, so that was the background to this stuff, and you pointed to it there. Interestingly, one could see some of this stuff in terms of the history of drugs in the UK. The 60s fueled by acid and weed, 70s maybe more by cocaine and speed in the punk era. And then when sort of MDMA came in, that combination of mixing with that sort of music, was that it? This strange kind of like constellation of things, the free festival circuit, MDMA, new type of music.
These massive waves of everyone doing the same thing came about when new music had come out that everybody liked, and new drugs had come out that everybody liked, and the production of the music had a lot to do with the experience on the drugs, without a doubt. They were co-created, and certainly the stuff I read about the 60s and psychedelic art and all of that kind of stuff really bears some comparison, and the form of the culture that is produced is importantly linked to the drugs that stimulate the scene, without a doubt.
Yeah, right. So we're going to fast forward to your time now, but just before we started, we were saying that in the intervening years, what actually happened, which was quite interesting, is that the Criminal Justice Bill came after Castle Morton, as you said. There's this clampdown on the kind of illegal warehouse or raves out in the countryside. But in fact, actually what happened is that people's appetite for that kind of music and for dancing was absorbed by the mainstream, wasn't it? Because that was the birth of that club culture, in this very city, right? Fabric and Heaven and those things. So it kind of went mainstream for a while, right?
Well, I've heard some talks about where the vacuum was that led to the original, the second Summer of Love, which was that clubs were very expensive. You had to wear stupid blooming clothes that cost a fortune from the high street to go. And no one played that music in venues. And as you say, that changed after the explosion of the rave scene. But I think it's easy to think that the Criminal Justice Bill happened and then illegal culture got shut down, but it's just not true. I mean, what they clamped down on people driving around the M25 and find hundreds of cars parked up waiting to be told where the rave was. But the areas where the authorities weren't looking are deep in the East End, or up by the North Circular, or places like this where there are huge abandoned buildings, and not areas that were heavily policed. And so using, I suppose, the emergence of mobile phones is key as well in this, because party line numbers were distributed. They could be changed every week or every month, and all you needed was to hand out black and white flyers with the name of the systems, the sound systems on, which was sort of people referred to as the party collectors by systems. So they'd have the name of the systems on and a few phone numbers on, and people would just phone up after 9 or 10 o'clock at night, find out where it was and go. So, the point is by the time the police found out about it, there would be, hundreds or thousands of people in the venue, at which point the police are not going to spend those resources, which aren't even booked on that night, or risk any, needless confrontations. And there became a sort of tacit understanding that the rave wouldn't disturb any normals, kind of thing. It would be
normals being people who don't rave.
People who don't rave, people who might be offended. They would. A good site for a squat party is somewhere where there's not lots of residential nearby, and that would, having scouted warehouses for my own parties, that was one of the main criteria, and I learned that from the people who I got to know from going to parties.
Right, so what you're saying is that after the Criminal Justice Bill, which for anybody who doesn't know was this attempt but to kind of legislate against these kind of illegal parties, and it had all these ridiculous things about repetitive beats and gatherings and all this sort of stuff. It was kind of slightly kind of Soviet style kind of social control, which didn't really work, right? But you're saying after that, so what happens is that club culture goes mainstream, the big expensive Heaven, fabric and all that stuff in the cities, but carries on underground for the people who want to do that, just a bit more out of the way, a bit more out of sight, a bit more discreetly.
There were probably enough laws for the police to break up raves before the Criminal Justice Act.
Right.
What it did was, codify a sort of series of criteria that made it very easy. But it was all against the law, inverted commas. And the point about pulling these things off is totally different from whether they're legal or not. And so, people became more and more sophisticated at doing what was required to make sure you could operate outside of the law and not get shut down.
Well, look, let's fast forward to you. So there you are in Wimbledon, nice church-going boy. You've opened the pages of the Sunday Times. There's a gigantic smiley face staring out at you.
I think it was a dove, actually.
Dove,
yeah.
Okay. That in combination with this intriguing episode of Inspector Morse, which I'm going to have to hunt down now.
Yes.
So what happened?
Well, I went to university. Sort of at the end of my first year of university, I fell in with a crowd, and we went partying 2-3 times a week. In our student union, they had lots of really good events. Great DJs like LTJ Bookham or DJ Shadow or Jeff Mills. Lots of people would come and play all the time, and then there were venues in town. And in the beginning of my second year, there was a Techno collective. This is in Newcastle upon Tyne, so far from London and far from the beaten track in many ways. But there was a Techno collective called the Rabble Alliance that started, and it was the traditional thing. We went to a pub called the Tanner's Arms on one side of Biker Bridge, and waited to be told where the location was. And the first party that they put on was about half a mile away under Biker Bridge in a railway archway. And it was an all-night party, probably finished at about 8-9 o'clock in the morning, and was, I think it ended up having a sort of mild legendary status. It was brilliant. It was a techno party. I met a huge number of people in one night, and as someone who struggled a lot socially at school, actually I look back on it now and think one of the probably initial reasons why I got so into the party culture is it's so accepting, and it's
kind of wonderful, isn't it? And also just exciting, waiting in the pub, waiting for the kind of the message to come through about where it is. I mean, there's something sort of daring do about it, isn't there?
And for me, I was living out the fantasy of, the Inspector Morse at that point, because it was just like it had been described to be, and it was very exciting in that sense. and felt illicit, and and there is that sort of. I used the word sexy, earlier, and I think there is something that's appropriate in a way. You're doing something you oughtn't to be.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether, of course, how connected it is to the the bonhomie and the kind of this sort of sense of empathy which is generated by MDMA or ecstasy, or whether it's the good vibes of the music, or just that general countercultural spirit of young people together doing something which is the bit risky and undercover, isn't it? But it's a sort of wonderful community. That sort of runs through it all as well, doesn't there? This kind of community thing as well. It kind of like eliminated the differences between people. You had all these different kind of people, punks, rockabillys, or whatever they were. That stuff kind of didn't matter anymore somehow. And also, I think there's this drop in football violence after the sort of the coming of the kind of the rave scene. That's been a sort of theme. I think one of the most positive things running through the kind of countercultural stuff from the 50s onwards is that sense of class breakdown. I mean, my projects have been Soviet Union, and one of the only kind of real Soviet subculture, the Stilyagi, who were these kids who dressed as far as they could in Western gear and listened to jazz and swing underground, on X-ray records or whatever. The interesting thing about that group was that in Soviet terms, it was classless, because you had, the sons and daughters, the so-called golden youth, who were the kids whose fathers and mothers were, high-level apparatchiks and diplomats and that sort of stuff. And you had, the intelligentsia's children, university lecturers and doctors and stuff, and then working class kids. And they were all kind of, together in it, because they were all doing something counter. Actually, I suppose that's it.
I think that's it. I received an education from a number of different people, an underground education, and as someone who I guess had been brought up in the middle class, taught to respect the law, I was educated in how you didn't have to, or how you could go about not respecting the law to do things that were important in some way, that were valuable in some way. And so, I mean, maybe there's a sense of respect, which I always had, of realising that was a gracious act on behalf of people who perhaps had every right not to share. Because I had privilege, but that never entered the conversation. That was never a dynamic. The point is, if you wanted to get involved, you were welcome. And I mean, people would, if you brought any of that sort of, privileged shit to the table, then you'd be quickly disabused of those notions. But I don't think I ever did. So it never happened.
So let's take you back to that morning. You've actually had a long night in the railway arch with. Great sounds. You're a young guy. You've just met all these people. You just had a sort of extremely exciting night. You're sitting around with them then and then. So take us on to the next step.
Yeah, I think those parties by the Rebel Alliance went on for a bit. They happened on consecutive weeks, which is sort of the aim, is to have a weekly or fortnightly scene or something every month. And
changing venue each time.
Yeah, change of venue. Actually, these venues were pretty close to the centre of town. I mean, and then it was 1999, and so the millennium was happening, and anyone who was around and going out at the time will remember that making plans for the millennium was a big deal. Probably a lot of people had a similar experience to us, which was a bit of a damp squib, but not in London. I heard on the squat parties were pretty good that year.
I was in San Francisco. It was
very nice,
very good.
But they planned, the squat parties to end all squat parties, and it was in the building where the rocket was built, the George Louis Stevenson locomotive.
It's an historic, it was
a heritage site, a derelict building, but a historic. Everyone who wore a badge in Newcastle that night were conscripted to work on the quayside, where they had the big fireworks display. None of them had a New Year's Eve. And the story that went round is that a bunch of those officers, the chippy ones, volunteered to go and break up the rave afterwards. And so lots of us had got to the party late, as you do, got there, just after midnight or something. And then within an hour, the place was just stormed, absolutely stormed by the cops, or the busies, as they're known by Geordies. And they were really destructive. They smashed the decks, they impounded the sound system. You know, I remember one story about a woman who was just surrounded by police dogs, and, you know, we all left and our millennium was ruined. And, you know, they did smash the scene, because, you know, no party crew that suffers that is going to emerge unscarred. And the conclusion became is we can't carry on doing this. They know who we are. They're desperate to clamp down on us. Any sound system we put in a building, we're going to lose.
So you think that was a kind of proactive, is that the right word, gesture to sort of say, like, okay, we know who you are, and this is what we're going to do if you carry on?
I think it was just on the night Schadenfreude. We haven't had any fun.
Right.
We want to go and have some fun by fucking over some ravers, basically. But, you know, the consequence of it was that, you know, it dealt a blow to this kind of, we're going to do this every week. So flash forward a few years, a bunch of London squat party heads turned up at this party in Newcastle. One of their about a dozen people, you know, really outlandishly dressed, who turned up at the club and then turned up at my mate's house afterwards. And this sort of stuff is normal in London, but it wasn't normal for my mates. They were sort of nice boys, and they got a bit put off by their confidence and by their request to cook up liquid ketamine in their kitchen.
Whoa,
and,
stop right there. Hold on a second, we've got to delve into that. So forgive me for not knowing all the chemistry of this stuff. So you cook up some ketamine in the kitchen. How does that work?
Well, it comes in a liquid form, and then you heat it up, and it turns into powder. And that's it. And again, something that was very common in London, but perhaps ketamine was an unheard of drug, or just, you know, almost like folkloric drug in Newcastle. No one had seen it, and these people had come up with a big bottle of the stuff, and it's like, oh my God, you know, who are these people? You know, and these
alien
nice
cyborgs,
Greek boys, alien cyborgs with
strange powder.
And I bumped into them the following day, and they told me that they'd taken, which means broken into, the Tyne Bridge, and would my friends like to come and DJ at a party there.
Now, for anybody who doesn't know, in Newcastle upon Tyne, there was this wonderful industrial piece of architecture, which is the bridge across the Tyne River, right? Yeah, it's a wonderful structure. Yeah. So when you say they'd taken it, I mean...
there are four big legs to it that go, I guess it's, you know, we're talking about 150, 200 feet up to the bridge level from the quayside. And they had a lift in all of them. And they'd taken one of these legs from the street level, from the bridge level, the 2 floors from there, which contain the top floor of the lift and then the workings of that lift, the cogs and pulleys and things above. And the party took place amongst all the lift works.
Above the lift?
Industrial. Properly industrial.
Okay.
And
it's not a big space though, right?
No, we're talking about, you know, maybe 150, 200 people at that eventual party. And this was the first thing I ever, you know, I was the broker. I introduced the DJs, and they came and DJ'd at this party, and it was amazing. I mean, especially considering the history of that. And you could get above the lift room, there was a ladder, and you'd get up to literally a bird's eye view on the quayside. It's the closest thing I could describe in London terms would be like doing a squat party in Tower Bridge.
You've got to take your hat off or something off to them. So they've just shown up, and the next day they've already kind of found a place to have the legal party, and they just get on with it, right?
They were, to use the Blues Brothers phrase, on a mission from God. You know, they were not members of one of the big systems down here, but they knew everyone. They were well networked, and they were trying to set their own thing up. Strong sense of, you know, methodology. They had a raver's handbook. This is how you go to a new town and do this thing.
Got it. Right.
And so first take the building, then say we've got this amazing building. Do you want to come and do a party in it? And of course, you know, it was entirely effective. And it's massively hubristic, and I say that in the most positive sense. It's just you've decided you can do something. You know, don't ask permission, take the building.
Okay, so you did this party. It's a big success, and obviously for you, it's a significant thing, right? So what happens?
I got to know the crew a little bit better, and I started visiting them in London. I'm born and bred in London, so I'd be back down here for, you know, university holidays and things. And I went to the big multi-rig being sound system, the big multi-rig squat party in Shoreditch on New Year's Eve, and that to me was another moment. akin to that first party I went to under Biker Bridge, but sort of bigger, because that was one sound system, and it was, atmosphere-wise, it was an introduction. But in terms of the audacity and the scale of this other thing, it was just another thing. And you're talking about 7 or 8 different rooms, which to me was massive at the time, but actually isn't that massive in squat party terms. And it was fronted up by a system called Underground Sound. And, if you've got any of your listeners who are familiar with the scene, they will undoubtedly know about Underground Sound.
It sounds big to me to have a Shoreditch party with 7 different rooms, 7 different sound systems. That's a lot of organising and stuff, and it's a squat, so effectively it's kind of done unofficially. So just fill out the picture, Will, about how something like that comes about, how it's organised, how the people who are going to go to it are contacted. You mentioned before about flyers and phones and stuff like that. Just give us the background to how it all happens.
Well, I suppose it's all a bit compartmentalised, or a cell structure or something. I mean, you've got the going concern, which in this case is Underground Sound. They've got a big following. They're going to be out somewhere on New Year's Eve, and wherever they go needs to be the big party. Or they have the resources for it to be the big party. And they talk to their mates who run other systems. There were a few different ones. There's one called Malfetters that was French-based. The kids of the Underground Sound formed one called Manic. There's a few different legendary systems around that time. But mostly it was like, we're going to have a techno room, we're going to have a drum and bass room, there'll be a dub room, maybe there's a house room. They'll tick all the boxes. And each collective will be able to provide their own sound system. They'll run their own bar, which is the principal way they'll make money, is by running the bar. And they'll obviously also sell their own drugs, which that income is shared to make it worth their while to cover the costs and wage people. Later when I was involved in helping run rooms at parties, a oneer or £100 would be a decent, a fair wage for working on a party all night. You get £100 for the central crew kind of thing. And obviously, the people who that's all they did with their lives, they needed to make more money off it. But I mean,
in terms of like how they found a property like that, so to squat it, I mean, how did, because that's a sort of, you're going to do a party. It's New Year's Eve, so it's important night.
Yeah,
there's going to be a lot of people involved, so you need to find somewhere that you're pretty damn sure that it's going to be okay. You're going to get through that evening. I mean, how did they take it, as you say, and how long did they hold it for, and the setup? I mean, to set up without anybody noticing, that's quite a feat in Shoreditch, isn't it?
In those days, Shoreditch was beginning to be the Shoreditch it is now, but nowhere near.
Right, I remember it was much
more forgotten area of town.
Yeah. Quiet in the weekends particularly. Yeah.
And I think it was sort of Lower Kingsland Road, just off Lower Kingsland Road where this happened. So, even a little bit, not the Liverpool Street side, if you see what I mean. And what you mentioned about the building is actually, something that made the scene quite democratic. If you wanted to get involved and you had the nerve, like my friend and mentor that pulled me into all of this, then you could just take a building and go talk to those systems and say, I've got a building. And my friend was a climber, and he literally just did not care about life or limb and was prepared to climb up several stories, because you could always get in through the roof. And if you needed to break in through a door, do it on the roof. No one can see you. They're not going to hear. You'll be fine. Take the roof, work the entrances from the inside, and change a lock, and then go change a padlock, and then bolt croppers, ankle grinders were the standard tools that you needed to have to take buildings. If you're lucky, you can prise the Cytex, which is the metal stuff on the outside of the windows, aside and climb in through a window. But the good buildings were secured a bit better than that, but the roof was always accessible if you could get up there.
And you had to have power, I'm assuming, or could you bring power in?
It depends. Some of these parties happen with generators. Most of them happen because they went behind the meter, which means that you ran the power from behind the bit that the electricity company turned in on or off, and you took the wires round. So you needed someone who was an electrician or trade to do this. and someone who wasn't going to electrocute themselves.
Or anybody else.
But, the dangerous bit happened before anyone was there.
Right.
And
so the building will be taken, say, a couple of weeks before or something? Or
yeah, something like that. Around the sort of Christmas period,
right.
which is, again, a period where, no one's looking, everyone's on Christmas. So people would take buildings around Christmas, and ideally it would take some organisation. You'd want the big systems like underground or whoever would want to know where the building was just before or just after Christmas. None of the party goers need to know until the night of New Year's Eve, or maybe the night before the word started to seep out. If you knew people,
so people would know that something's going to happen, but you don't know where.
You had phone numbers. That's the important thing. People had underground party lines saved into their phone, and they changed it when it got updated.
Got it.
And you didn't actually even need a flyer. You just called the number, and everyone knew each other or knew a bunch would be done under cover of darkness the night before, because you've got fairly big trucks and things that have got to come in with all the sound system and the lights and all of that kind of stuff. The bar is quite quite sizable mass, getting all these slabs. But you'd have people. There was a guy who used to come and deliver cash or return. He'd drive his van, give you all the beer, come back later for the money. It's an economy that sprang up.
Just walk us through the day or the afternoon of New Year's Eve before it starts to open to the punters.
Well, you've got people at that stage. All the crews are inside setting up lights, sound system, finding bits of furniture to use as a bar, it's just set up going in every room of the party, and lots and lots of phone calls for things that were supposed to be there or not, or chat with DJs and all of the rest of it, and people checking that the party line phone was charged up, and that someone had, there was a moment where someone would have to record the message at about 6 o'clock or something. And the important thing is the location didn't need to get out early enough that the police would get wind of it, because you are just a sitting duck with all of this equipment in a building. If it takes comparatively few police to come and shut down a party before it started. The minute it's an hour old and you've got a few hundred people there, it's now not possible to do anything about it.
By the time you've got a few hundred party goers in there, if the police, unless they're prepared to devote huge on-the-spot resources to it, which obviously they're not going to be able to do on New Year's Eve because they've got better things to be getting on with, right? There's no way they can actually stop it. All they can do maybe is turn up and just keep an eye on things, right? So you become sort of immune to that, right? And that's how it works, is it? Is get past that point of actually opening the doors. What time are the doors open, by the way?
Before midnight,
right.
Sort of 9-10ish, something
right.
like that. Yeah,
so,
but no one turned up. Actually on New Year's Eve, most people turned up after midnight.
Right.
You do your midnight somewhere with your mates, and then you go to the rave.
Right.
But some people got in before midnight.
Right. So by then it's just too late.
It's too late, and they were all busy on the Thames side dealing with really antisocial behaviour from drunk people, which actually requires their resources.
Or protecting the public.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And like I say, the whole principle of putting on a rave is you try not to cause disturbances, and the job of the security at the party would be to mind the immediate surroundings of the building, to make sure there's not anything really sketchy going on that's going to require the involvement of law enforcement. You'll get vulnerable again when it's all over. If you've been in an antisocial party, then there may be motivation for law enforcement to come down and impound some systems. But when you're at the London scale, the economy is larger, and things being impounded isn't going to kill your crew like it did up in Newcastle. That equipment was actually owned by a professional production hire company, and it caused serious problems.
Right.
But they even had a term called a suicide system. If you're going to go and do something really cheeky, you cobble together old cabs and old amps and everything, and you put it somewhere super cheeky, and you just walk away from it. But also, this is another great story of collectivism, is that there have been many occasions where the cops are outside, you know they're going to impound the system, and people at the party are given a speaker each, and they just carry them out with them, and they assemble past the police ring. loaded onto the van, and off it goes.
Right, so everybody mucks in
Yeah.
to make sure it keeps going. So, okay, you got through the night. It's been a great night. Well, tell us about the vibe. I mean, tell us about that. I mean, whether you're behind the scenes or whether you're actually a party goer. I mean, just...
Well, it's why we all were there. It's why the system's bothered, because all of these people, got paid by licensed premises too, or most of them did, but they chose to concentrate their output in the squat party scene because you couldn't have that atmosphere any other way. You had to be outside of licensed premises, outside of the law, in order to create that freedom. And for me, what I experienced that night that I perhaps hadn't experienced before was incredible openness in terms of it's normal to speak to a stranger. It's absolutely normal. And people talk, that's why I believe people buy tickets for festivals in such numbers. But is that you can just talk to the person next to you and go, oh, look at that over there, and they'll have a conversation back with you.
Yeah, you're setting your tent up in the field and you're chatting to the person who's setting up the tent.
That's why people go.
Yeah, I think
because
that's right.
people don't like living in cities where you all have to watch where you look on the tube and stuff. But in squat parties, it really was another level of that. And beyond that, bona fide psychic phenomena. People coming up to you, giving you something that you were thinking about needing, and they just hand it to you because somehow your thought wave transmitted. And this sort of thing is amplified by drugs. In my experience, the reason that ketamine was so popular on the acid techno scene was because it makes people very aware of the people they're with. Its effect is extraordinarily different according to where you consume it and who you consume it with. And at the party, it had an effect different from anywhere else. And I believe that sensitivity sort of enhanced people's psychic capacity. So people did, without meaning to, receive thought waves. I mean, it sounds really far out, but all I can say is I've experienced it in a material way. Right. It's not me kind of being cosmic. I'm not really a cosmic person. It just happened, and it's indisputable for me.
That's also, why those events, maybe 68, 88, and 98, and when you're 2008 even, you're talking about is that's why people remember them later on, isn't it? But so, Will, for you, let's kind of fast forward. So this is your first big squat party. Then just take us on a sort of whistle-stop tour of the rest of your experience with these kind of squat parties and this kind of underground.
See, I was still in Newcastle living, but I kind of took that attitude of let's just do it back to Newcastle with me, and I decided I want to put on my own squat party for the first time. And I went and I found a building, actually with my London mentor, identified this one sort of in a less congested part of the quayside, but quite close to the Tyne Bridge actually, as a good place. You could fit plenty of people in. It had turned out it was a building that had been looked at from some of these old squat party heads that had been involved in Rebel Alliance. I found a system, my mates were going to DJ, I talked to some of the rabble people about going behind the meter, and they said to me, you've got to open a fire exit before we're going to do this for you, because we want people to be safe. They've got a normal sort of house-sized doorway, which is your front door, but if something goes wrong, and you can't have 500 to 1,000 people trying to get out through a tiny door. The fire exit had a breeze block wall in front of it, and in a way this is why it had never been partied before. And taking the advice of my friend, my mentor from London, went down to knock down the breeze block wall. And the advice I received is, if you're going to do something sketchy like that, do it in the day. If you do it at night time, obviously something's wrong. So we had a high-vis tabard and a scruffy high-vis jacket and a sledgehammer in the middle of the afternoon in broad daylight, and set about knocking down this wall. And I look back on it enormously fondly. I don't think I'll have another time in my life where something I wanted so badly I had to get to through a physical barrier, and I had a sledgehammer in my hands and I was going to smash through that wall, literally. And I wasn't a terribly physical person, but just wanted to do it and never knocked a wall down before. And and then it would all just collapses, and you clear the rubble out, and I phoned the electrician and said it's done.
It's quite symbolic, isn't it, that knocking on the wall then?
Yeah, I didn't see it that way at the time, but it really is. I mean, it's.
How did the party go?
Lots of people had a great time. Like I said, the squat party scene had really broken up a lot, so anything like that happened was really prized. The Geordie community loved free parties. I suppose, my kind of reputation as someone who can do was enhanced by it.
Because you went on to do lots more, didn't you, then?
I did a lot of outdoor parties, and then there was another one in a club in town that was half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from Newcastle police station, and in a club that had been the Powerhouse, which was the main gay club, and then Scotland Yard, ironically, it was called, and hosted a lot of sort of Ninja Tune style nights there, DJ Food, people like that, and as a club, lots of people had been to it, and it was a great venue, and no one thought you could do it. And this was very much done with my London party crew mates. They drove a Luton up with all the sound system, broke the building on the night, a few hours before the party. And, I looked at my mate and I said, we can't do that, it's too cheeky. And he just looked at me, dead serious, saying, it's the only building I'm interested in doing. And I went, okay,
let's do it.
I've told everyone it's happening. If we fail, my rep suffers. But I just believed in him, and he got it done. And there I was standing on the front door.
I like that
all night.
about this whole thing as well, because there is not only the element of risk from the kind of authorities, but there's the element of risk of it all sort of going wrong, or getting closed down, or not working out, and then you look like an idiot in front of all your community people. So we're going to have to fast forward quite quickly now, Will, because we're running out of time. So just give us a quick sort of trip through the next iteration of your squat party life before you go mainstream in your as much mainstream as you went.
I suppose the culmination for me was having sort of, been a wide-eyed person looking at these incredible parties. And there are lots of things we haven't mentioned, actually, like party inside the Ring of Steel after September 11th, in Mansion House in the city, happening all weekend during the summer.
Ring of Steel being?
The Ring of Steel was the security designation where policing was serious inside the City of London, inside the square mile sort of thing. Another one at a vast furniture warehouse in North Acton with 100 metres of glass, down one side of the building, and a stadium strobe with 30, 40 rigs in. The scale just kept opening up to me as I did more of this. But, towards the sort of latter end of the acid techno squat party era, I put on a party with, Manic sound system and another collective called Everyone Sound. I put on a room where we had a Geordie system, so I brought all the artists down from Newcastle, and I was an equal party doer, and was there for 4 days in a row, setting up, partying, taking down. And I suppose for me that was sort of a culmination of from the outside to the inside. I suppose it got really hard to keep on putting on squat parties, and
because of the whole changing city, less buildings less available, or the authorities getting wise to it. And
I don't really think it was the buildings. I mean, it did get tougher, but there was the rep about this kind of criminal underground was entirely distorted. But in terms of outside the law, there were always tons of people outside the law. To put on a squat party, you had to have an arrangement with the local crime family. Well, they would come down with their heavies, armed, and break up your party, and people could get hurt. So, and there were also a lot of people who, were involved in petty crime or, things like that. People who, would stand people up and rob them at the party. Now, when the party was going, they didn't. Everyone enjoyed themselves, and it was one of the magical things. You knew that it could go wrong, but it didn't because the vibe was so amazing. And so all of these kind of, dodgy elements were workable with. But what started to happen as the scene became more well-known is other people came, younger people actually, early to mid-teens people who didn't come for the music, didn't come because they wanted to dance. They only came because they knew there were people high on drugs there that were easy to rob. And so you'd be pickpockets. You used to be able to leave your bag for half an hour, come back, and it would be untouched. But you couldn't have your bag on you and it be untouched. And the people who put on the parties were getting robbed. And so, these were tough people, but it stopped being worth their while because these were tough people who wanted it to all be fluffy. That's why they did it, because that was magic, and that stopped being possible. And the people who had the systems and could break the buildings and could run the bars stopped being worth their while. And so the scene kind of died a bit. In terms of it being regular. I mean, they still happen, but there's not this.
Yeah, and we
scene.
talked. So that's interesting. So it was not really the authorities; it was more that the criminality aspect of it. I did an interview with Andrew and Susan, who ran the Fridge, the Ritzy before that, and they set up the Fridge and ran that. And it was interesting to see that kind of arc with them too. Is that criminal elements got involved, even their own security guys turned on them at one point, and it got quite heavy, and they got to the point where it's like, well, we loved this, but we're not loving it anymore, and that's the time to sort of.
Yeah, these were people from outside of the scene that came in. I kind of don't want to. I don't want to give the impression like, the seeds of its destruction were always inbuilt. That's not how it was. The party culture maintained itself perfectly well, in my view. It just
attracted the wrong
became
sort.
too known about, and people. It was always based around, people who'd had a rough life, had a rough upbringing, and they'd chosen to pull themselves out and do something really good, that was so good that people who had privilege flocked to it as well. They really had solved some of their problems. They'd done some amazing stuff, but then, like anything, if it gets too well known about, outside forces come in to disrupt it. And partly the authorities were that, but that's not what stopped the people who were making them happen. It was, there were vultures out there.
Well, I mean, that is the story also of the counterculture, isn't it? We talked earlier about, club culture itself. I mean, club culture has been such an important part of counterculture because it's all connected with youth culture and subculture. Right, but I mean, so there's two forces at work, aren't there? It gets absorbed into the mainstream, which of course happened with that sort of music and the club culture. The expensive clubs, and the whole Ibiza scene and all that, it could be quite pricey, but also it's quite mainstream in a way, isn't it? And then also you've got at the other end this outside elements kind of nibbling away at it. We were talking earlier also about the festival scene. Of course, the free festival scene evolved into the festival scene, didn't it? Because, there's as well as the huge corporate ones, there's still great festivals that you've got to pay for to get a ticket to go, but they're still great. They're still countercultural in some way, aren't they? There's still, as you said, there's still that sense of, turning up and people having a different kind of experience than their ordinary lives, And so in some ways, actually, that stuff evolves, doesn't it, into the mainstream or the culture.
Well, there was always crossover in the sense that if you were someone who was on the party scene, you probably knew a way to get into festivals for free. Either you're stewarding or helping someone, run a stall or whatever. You were well networked. But there was always a difference between festivals and parties because festival systems have to turn off at 5 and they can't turn on again until 11 o'clock or something. And it's very important the music doesn't stop. That is a precondition of what was squat party culture. But I mean they were great. Festivals are great, but the perhaps less supportive of divergent types. Some of the dodgy geezers would be vibed out of a festival environment where they were, at the heart of the squat party movement.
Got it, yeah.
And I guess there was crossover. Squat parties sort of diminished a bit. Festivals were exploding at the same time, and it just sort of people ended up doing more of that than the other a bit. I mean, I also don't want to give the impression that this has stopped. It hasn't stopped. I mean, I've got older, and so I less know where it all is.
That's another part of the counterculture, isn't it? We always talk about it as though it's in the past. It's always going on somewhere. There's always an underground somewhere. I mean, it might be in South London, halfway up a tower block. It's going on somewhere. You just don't see it at first. By the time you see it, it's probably not the underground
I'm
anymore,
not as networked as I was at that time. I don't have the numbers.
I think also, and also in London anyway, they got to a time, didn't it, where there was a DJ in every bar. There's like bars themselves became like mini parties. Here's another quote from the Museum of Youth Culture, Will, for you, and it's obviously talking about the rave scene. It starts with a moment separating a before and an after party, I guess. It might be sparked by a drug, ecstasy especially, but really this experience meant a wider discovery of belonging, of discovering different attitudes to race, sex and gender, to dancing bodies and sharing personal spaces, to culture, from increased travel, more pleasure and growing cosmopolitanism. Coming from somewhere meant being part of this wider shared change. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, yeah, it does. The shared change is an interesting feeling about it. I mean, I think for the people it worked for, it was a transformative experience. With me, I took from me that sense of confidence that you can decide you want to go somewhere and just do it, and just get yourself there and not ask permission. And that, when I started working in licensed events, was really helpful. I just felt I had a right to be places, which perhaps I didn't when I was a young person who struggled at school and stuff. So
it gave you the confidence to do those things. I mean, you've done many things since. You've DJed all over the place internationally. You've run your own nights. You've been involved in 1,000 festivals and stuff since. So you're still kind of like, and do you see that is a kind of flowering of those early experiences then?
I think the idea that you might have an idea in your head that might not have cultural currency at that time, but that's because it's not known about. Just like those parties, they're hidden history. No one knows they happened. Still to this day, there are some good photographic books, but there aren't any real writings about it all.
Well, Tofu told me about the rave, the squat scene, which he was in a bit earlier. But, there's this whole network in Europe of squats, people, in connection with this sort of pre-Facebook era, this kind of social... This sort of social connections, and he was in a band which toured squats, internationally for years, and that the free festival scene sort of like emerged or was kind of refreshed out of that, and it absolutely is a hidden history, isn't it? I mean, it's a forgotten story for now, anyway.
And what that taught me is that the worthiness of an idea isn't dictated by the fact that it's known about or at this point respected, and the things. I got involved in a number of things at the same time about sort of 13 or 14 years ago that weren't big cultural things at the time and quite quickly became so. And I guess my confidence to try and do those new things probably was inspired by, that idea that actually behind these closed doors are things that people don't know about that are amazing. And if you've got the hubris and the determination, you can change the fact that they're not known about. And in licensed places, you're not going to get suddenly closed down. If you can get yourself a budget and a booking, it will definitely happen.
So if you're out there doing something interesting behind a closed door, let us know. So Will, give us a picture, paint the picture of the room at the squat party, as you call it, the rig aesthetics.
Yeah, it's quite different from clubs, and it's different from festivals too, because those environments are a lot more carefully planned. Someone's thought about every square foot of the wall space to make it, attractive. But the whole point about a squat party is you're in an abandoned building. If you cover it all up, you're ruining the point of being there. So the most important things was you have a wall of sound. You may have speakers in four corners, but you'll have a wall of sound at the front with the DJs in the middle. You have really good lights. That is definitely important. I saw stadium-size lighting rigs in these parties. And then you would often just have one banner, which went everywhere, and it would have the name of the rig. And the style was quite interesting because, unlike psychedelic art, where you look at it and you feel like you're tripping, if you looked at these drops sober, you would think they're quite simple. But they've been conceived with the idea of people looking at them whilst they're on drugs and the kind of, squat party drugs that everyone took. And so, there would essentially be depth that your adult mind would infer into these paintings that you wouldn't be doing sober. They'd just be flat. So they're kind of this sort of hidden relief paintings the dimensions only appearing when people are high, and that could be contact high. It doesn't mean you have to be stimulated, but when you were in that space, when the party was in that space, and suddenly the art would leap into itself.
Right.
And the other part of it that's quite interesting is that it's not per se aesthetic. Was people are very sophisticated about, there's some old filing cabinet gets dragged over here, put on its side in a given place in the room, because that's where people are going to want to sit, or it's in the right relation to where the rig and the exit is and the window, and people would find these old bits of whatever it is, disused trash or whatever it is, and do things that became incredibly important later on, and it's an extra dimensional way of understanding the space.
So you also mentioned earlier, which I was intrigued by, is this thing called the Sunday night party. What was that?
Seasoned partygoers, from their experience, realised that the bit that was really worth going for was the Sunday night. It's the same at festivals. The Sunday's always the best bit. It's all settled down. The need to sort of have an experience has gone, and people are just more prepared to be. Obviously it's Sunday night, so the residential stuff's a bit more sensitive. Sometimes the rigs would be turned down to colossally low levels, and everyone's just so tuned in at this point. I mean, remember, it's a repetitive beat. It's just the doof, doof, doof. And your ears don't need it to be loud. They can find it. You'd be hearing people's voices sometimes equally with the sound, but it was still doing its job. And yeah, I mean, there's also the effect of people who have been on drugs for 24 hours as opposed to 3. Just a calmness, that's where all the, I talk about things like psychic phenomena, that's where they're really happening. That's where the surprising conversations and connections with people you didn't know would happen the most.
You've been through something together, right? You've been through this kind of
and then
intense experience.
You often leave with people you'd never met before and go back to their house, and that was normal.
And then it's Monday.
And then it's Monday, and for most people, people with jobs, Sunday night is Sunday night. For people who rave, then Monday night is Sunday nights. You've left, or Monday day, you've left the party, you've gone to someone's house, you carry on till Monday night. Maybe kip on the sofa there and then go home Tuesday morning, and then it all starts again Thursday night.
Well, listen, Will, we've reached our own Sunday night, Monday morning here. We've run out of time, but thank you so much. That was a wonderful wander through the wild world of the Acid House Squat Party.
Thank you.
I hope they're still going on somewhere. I mean, I do feel like I missed out, actually, by missing all that stuff. Let's trust that they are going on, like the counterculture always is, somewhere just out of sight. If you listen to this, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and Will's stories. We'll be back next time with more stories from the other side, from the counterculture. You can check them all out at www.bureauoflostculture.com and on all major podcasters now. If you listen via Apple or anywhere else where you can leave a review, do leave us a review. We'd appreciate that. And of course, be in touch. See you, hear you next time. I am Stephen Coates.